From the Toronto Star, I'm Raji Mudder, and this matters. The climate crisis is the issue of our times, and many experts say that now is a critical time to try and stem the tide of environmental change. In this election campaign, emission targets, the oil and gas sector, carbon plans, and clean technology are some of the things addressed in the platforms released by each of the parties. And this topic has already provided some zingers in the last leaders' debate.
There is so much we can do to get our emissions down, but grow a strong economy, because without a strong economy, we can't tackle climate change. We can't tackle the issues of today.
The reality that Mr. O'Toole has never understood is you can't have a strong economy unless you tackle climate change.
You're talking about the future. Let's talk about right now. You had 6 years. You've got the worst track record in all the G7 after 6 years. How can people trust you?
That is one of the questions Canadians have to ask themselves in this election. Which party do you trust most to take on climate change? Alex Ballingall is an Ottawa-based reporter for The Star, who covers federal politics. He joins us to discuss climate change and how it's being dealt with as an issue during this election. Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So Alex, obviously this is the issue of our times, and we are, what some experts are saying, a critical time to tackle the climate crisis. Now, their climate plans have been released as part of their platforms. And it was funny, I was about to say that it hadn't really been brought up that much in this election, but at the English language debate last week, it actually got a fair bit of time. Let's start about from there, though. Alex, do you think that the climate crisis has got enough attention in this campaign so far?
I mean, maybe it depends on if you asked a climate activist or environmentalist, they would say, hell no to that question. We have BC burning. We have that big IPCC report that came out that was the latest sort of big alarm bell on the state of the climate and how, the planet's the hottest it's been in 125,000 years. So, I mean, with headlines like that and sort of this sense of crisis that seems to be spreading, you could argue that there hasn't been enough time paid to it. But there has been, as you say, in the debate, there was a large clash. One of the big, sort of points of conflict in the debate was over climate policy. In the battle for progressive voters, I think we've seen this a bit more. Trudeau's obviously tried to paint the Conservatives as regressive on this issue. And then on the left, we've had Jagmeet Singh really going hard after Trudeau as all talk, no walk on climate, and Trudeau going after Singh as, basically he's pie in the sky and he doesn't have details on his plan. So it's definitely been an issue that everyone's wrestled with through the campaign, but it depends who you ask on whether it's been enough. As I'm sure a lot of people would say they would like to see more focus on this. I mean, Annamie Paul, for example, the Green leader, wanted a leaders' debate exclusively focused on this, which didn't happen, but that would have been very interesting.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about these platforms. I mean, what do you think are the key pieces? And obviously, let's start with emissions targets, because it's always a big one.
Yeah, so the platforms, I mean, basically we've got the Liberal target, which is Canada's official target right now after they updated it earlier this year, which is to get to at least 40% below 2005 greenhouse gas emissions levels by 2030. The Conservatives would basically change that target back to what it was 6 months ago or whatever when the Liberals changed it, which was the target that Stephen Harper set and then the Trudeau Liberals maintained for so many years, which is 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. Then the NDP says they'd go beyond the Liberals to 50%. And then the Greens say we need to get to 60%. So there's sort of like a spectrum of ambition from the Conservatives at 30 to the Greens at 60%.
That's targets.
That's targets.
Now, I mean, I think the other giant issue, particularly out west, is the oil and gas sector. Let's talk about what the focus is there and what the parties are saying about it. What are the goals?
So, yeah, again, there's sort of a spectrum on that. The Conservatives, I guess we can start with them, support the oil and gas industry. They want more oil and gas exports. In this election, Aaron O'Toole's talked about the Northern Gateway Pipeline, which would be a new pipeline that was a proposal that died a few years ago that would go through northern BC to the coast, where there's currently the Liberals placed an oil tanker ban on oil tankers taking exports from the northern BC coast. So the Conservatives would remove the ban. They'd want to support some sort of pipeline there. They want to sell more natural gas. So that they're big supporters of this industry. Liberals, one of the big things that's different for them, they obviously, they're pushing through the government-owned Trans Mountain expansion, which is very controversial for some people. But this time they're also saying, okay, Oil and gas has been the source of emissions for Canada that the largest growing, I guess. And it's now, of all the sectors, it's the biggest one. It's more than a quarter of our national emissions. And it's gone up significantly since 2005, while overall emissions have sort of stayed flat. So it's kind of, a lot of people say that's the thing that's holding us back. Liberals say we recognize that. And now if they get reelected, they will cap emissions from the oil and gas sector at what they are now. And then they'll have 5-year plans so that in the future, it's only going to go down until it's net zero. The NDP, they have a similar thing where they're talking about carbon budgets, so a cap on emissions for sectors. And then they say they would also remove fossil fuel subsidies. So any public money that exists that the Liberals will put in that goes to fossil fuel companies, they would eliminate that. And then the Greens have the most sort of hardcore position on oil and gas. They say no new development straight up starting now. They'd cancel everything that's in progress and they would phase out oil and gas production completely by 2035. So they're the only party with like an actual goal to stop this. So that, again, that's sort of the spectrum of positions on oil and gas, which is, again, as I said, a major source of our emissions, which is one of the big ways that Canada can actually start making progress finally on reducing its emissions.
This is a wide question. What else sort of sticks out from some of the platforms? Are there any other particular battlegrounds that jump out to you?
Well, I think everyone's sort of talking about, okay, so everyone has a carbon price now. There's differing opinions on oil and gas. There's differing opinions on the level of ambition to get to whatever strength of the target. I think those are the major sort of points of contention. After that, we're kind of getting into the weeds on policy and sort of everyone kind of has promises around like zero emission vehicles and different levels of ambition on how to promote switches to electric vehicles. Like the Greens said they would ban the sale of internal combustion engines. I can't remember when, it might be 2030 or 2035. I'd have to check the exact, but they want to ban that in the coming years. Everyone else sort of has a sales target. Like the Liberals want to have 100% new sales by 2035. Conservatives want to have 30% by 2030. NDP wants to have stronger incentives for made in Canada zero emission vehicles. So everyone, and same with like making the electricity grid run more on renewable power. They have different dates for when they'd want to achieve that, retrofitting buildings. So everybody kind of has different policies around all those issues. But the big points of contention, I would say, are what to do about the oil and gas industry, what to do about the carbon price potentially, and then who's got the more strident targets or whatever.
Justin Trudeau is the obvious target, and the Liberal plan is already obviously throwing around a lot of money. I mean, what sticks out to you? One of the things it seems that they have is a large focus on sort of freshwater initiatives, like starting up a new commission. That doesn't seem to be in any of the other parties' plans.
Yeah, that's part of the push that the Liberals had while they're in power to conserve more of Canadian nature. Their target has been to have 30% of Canada's land, oceans, and water, freshwater mass under conservation by 2030. A big part of that push has been creating like Indigenous guardianship programs where Indigenous nations get money to conserve parts of their territory, sort of like provincial park, national park kind of things, under sort of Indigenous conservation, which the NDP, I can't remember the dollar amount, but they have promises in that vein as well. So that's basically the idea, is conserving more nature, not only just because it's pristine, it's beautiful, but also because it protects species from extinction and endangerment, and then also acts as a buffer against, like carbon sinks, protecting forests and other aspects of nature that counteract the pollution that causes climate change. So it's all part of that thinking.
We'll be right back. Okay, let's talk about the Conservative plan, which, as you said, the Liberals are trying to paint as regressive. And while there are lower targets, if you actually look at their platform, it's not that far off from the other parties' plans, which seems like a big change for them. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think when you talk to the climate policy experts and the environmentalists, almost all of them say this is a credible plan to get to the 30% by 2030 target, the old target. And it's basically, in their assessment, they would say it's the best conservative climate plan they've ever seen, but it's not good enough if Canada wants to do its fair share in the global fight against climate change. But yes, it's certainly a major change for them. And the biggest change, I think, obviously, is them accepting that there should be a carbon price and dropping what was a very heated fight that kind of almost consumed all the oxygen in the climate debate federally for a number of years, with the resistance premiers and Conservatives under Andrew Scheer and Doug Ford as well, really just hammering this as like a job-killing tax on everything. Now they're proposing their own version of that, and they've completely dropped that anti-carbon price rhetoric, which is a very significant change because now all the parties on the table in the federal election endorse what a lot of experts see as one of the best ways to actually incentivize the reduction of emission across society. It's also, a debate about which carbon price is better is now part of the mix, which is a very big difference from the 2019 election.
Alex, this is interesting because the carbon tax has been the issue that other parties have been able to use as a wedge against the Conservatives. How important was it for O'Toole to address and neutralize that attack this time around?
Yeah, I think when they were against the carbon price, it was much easier to convince the average person who isn't in the weeds on climate policy and doesn't, follow in close detail the nitty-gritty on this stuff, that this party doesn't take this seriously and they don't even maybe believe in it, a lot of them, and just to paint them in that regard on climate change. Now that they have one, even though once you drill into the details, the debate, is around, well, maybe it would be weaker, maybe their rebate, the way that they pay people back for paying the carbon price wouldn't have as strong as an incentive. They would only cap it at $50 a ton for consumers rather than $170. So once you get into the details of it, it becomes clear that it wouldn't be as strong as what the other parties are proposing. But for the average voter who doesn't get into that policy nitty-gritty, I think you're right that them having their own carbon price diminishes the potency of the attack against them, that they are regressive on climate change because they are proposing a carbon price of their own.
Let's talk about the NDP and the Greens. Trudeau is obviously fending off attacks from both sides. How does he deal with these parties with further reaching plans who want to seem even more progressive?
Essentially by saying that, the Liberal plan has more detail and has been thought out and they have the policy heft, whereas the other parties have sort of vague promises around this and haven't costed them out and haven't spelled out exactly in technical ways how they would get to significantly more ambitious targets than what the Liberals were proposing. Like the NDP, for example, they say that the carbon price has these two components, the tax on fuel and the industrial price that heavy industries like oil and gas and steel and cement pay. And the NDP has been attacking that industrial carbon price that Liberals created as an exemption that lets the big polluters off, implying that they would dismantle it and it would be much tougher. But what they would actually do is just basically maintain the system, but make it more expensive. So like just crank it up and just make it a bit more strenuous for heavy emitters. So that it wouldn't be completely dismantled and they have to pay the carbon price on all of their emissions. They'd have to pay it on it. I know I'm getting technical here, but depending on how you looked at it, they would make it more strenuous for those industries. But would changes like that make up for another 10% of emissions reductions by, in the next 8 years? They haven't spelled that out. We don't know. If they've done a projection or a modeling on that, we haven't seen it. So they haven't spelled out exactly how they would get there. And the Liberals, meanwhile, have done those modeling. They've been in government. And as of the 2021 budget, according to government projections, Canada, if they implemented all the climate measures in place as of this year's budget, Canada would be on pace to get to 36% below 2000. So almost to the Liberal target. And that's without their cap on oil and gas emissions and all these other things that they're promising in this election. So the Liberals, in fending off the attacks from the left on this issue, I think say, well, we have a detailed plan. We have projections that show how we're going to get there. Where are your projections? Where are your details? I think that's the way they're trying to defend against the increased ambition from the Greens and the NDP.
Okay, I feel really bad because this is going to feel a little gossipy because I got to say that reading a bunch of your stories on sort of the Green Party internal drama was like the sideshow leading up to this election. One, who knew hippies could be so mean? But my question is, Alex, any thoughts on that internal drama and how it's affecting their campaign?
Yeah. So, I think if it's done anything, it can only hurt them, right? Like in the months leading up to an election, we have a very public and very intense leadership crisis where top-ranking members of our own party are trying their hardest to get rid of her in the weeks leading up to a widely expected election. Somebody across the floor to the Liberals. There was a huge argument about the party's stance on Israel-Palestine, an issue over which the party will, I think it's safe to say, never have any direct influence whatsoever. And then they had financial troubles. There was a question about whether they would be able to have enough money to run a serious campaign. And they ended up getting a bank loan, but it sounds like it's less money than what they were able to spend last time. Annemie Paul's only campaigning in the riding where she's lost twice is Liberal stronghold in downtown Toronto, where it's going to be very hard to win. So yeah, the whole situation for them is extremely challenging. And like, as she said in the debate, the English debate, she's been crawling through glass to get here. And I think she's referring to a lot of that it's been a tough ride for her as leader of the Green Party so far. But yeah, how does that play into the climate debate? Until climate action became a very serious mainstream policy, something that all parties have to say something about. It was really the Greens rallying on this. And it was really the Greens that were being the Greens trying to force this into the mainstream conversation for many years. Having a weaker Green Party in this election might not mean as much as it would have had climate change not become such a mainstream issue. They certainly still have the most hardcore plan to cut emissions. They want, 60%, phase out the oil sands, cancel all new fossil fuel development. But all the other parties have something to say and have plans that are also ambitious. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say about their drama. It's been fascinating to cover it. And it's sometimes been surprising at what turns that story has taken. But I think for Annamie Paul and her political career, the next few days of the campaign and whether or not she is successful in Toronto Centre will have a huge bearing on what happens next for her.
I said this off the top. This is the issue of our times, and this should be the issue that galvanizes the youth vote. But in such a short and crunched campaign, do you think it will have a big impact on the polls? And any thoughts on youth turnout?
I think for a lot of people, it is one of their top issues. I'm from the interior of BC, and I just know that like every time I call home and talk to people from Kamloops that, they're talking about the forest fires. They're talking about, is this kind of just what summer is now, where I can't see the sun and like the town an hour's drive to the west burns to the ground. We've always had forest fires out there, but the big hardcore seasons seem to be happening more often. So I think it is for a lot of people becoming, for so many years, it's felt like almost like an abstract long-term thing. Oh, our grandkids are going to have there's going to be no New York City in 2100 because our grandkids are going to have, it seemed like something that seems so far down the line that it's hard to imagine. With more and more extreme weather events and heat waves, the heat dome, all these things we've seen, intense hurricanes more frequently, I think it's starting to become more visceral for people and climbing up that, ranking of issues that moves people's votes. It'll be interesting to see youth turnout. I don't know if people will be motivated to vote, if the pandemic will have sort of a dampening effect on turnout, if the fact that this election, happened at all, there's a measure of dissatisfaction about the necessity of this election that will keep people away from the polls. I don't know. It's a very good question. But I think in terms of the relevance of climate change, I think in recent years, it's only gone up in a lot of people's minds. And, it might continue to climb as we see more and more extreme events and the actual consequences of climate change starting to impact our lives.
Alex, this has been fantastic for us. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know?
I would just encourage the listeners to, don't listen to what I'm saying about all this. Like, check out the platforms and give them a read yourself and assess them for yourselves and do your own analysis and come to your own conclusions. If issue, take a long, hard look at what they're offering and please vote.
Excellent advice. Alex, really, really want to thank you for your time today.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Alex Ballingall is an Ottawa-based reporter for The Star who covers federal politics. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Raju Mudler. Our This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachneck, Saba Etizaz, and Sean Pattenden. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenden. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.